joined us so far for our fifth and last CATS Innovation webinar series. We know that the webinars and the summit have come to an end, but we encourage everyone to stay in touch and use this network as a place to be innovative and think creatively together until next TIGA, and make sure to look out for our sessions at the next CATS Innovation Summit. We hope that you'll all join us. And we're so thrilled that Mark Oppenheimer is here today with us to conclude our series. Mark was a columnist for the New York Times for many years, and now hosts a very cool weekly podcast called Unorthodox, produced by Tablet Magazine. And he has a great sort of outside but inside view of what works and doesn't work within the Jewish innovative world, and he's here to share with us today. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. The first thing is I want credit for my t-shirt, for my Yosemite t-shirt, which I wore for all of you. Thank you. It's really an honor to be asked. One of the really nice things about quitting my New York Times column a couple years ago was that it gave me more freedom and time to spend doing work just, in the Jewish space, which is something that I've always worked in Jewish journalism as well as secular journalism, but especially as my kids get older, it's something I have such a personal stake in, especially, the Jewish education sort of zero through college piece of it in particular. So this is something I'm really, really, really happy to do, and I'm grateful to be asked. Let me say a few things as a preamble. First of all, there are few enough of you now before I'm sure some more people join that I could actually find out who all of you are. So why don't we go around and I'll call on you and you can say just quickly, whom you're repping. So I see Cornell up there. What's up, Cornell?
Hi, my name is Dana. I'm the Springboard Fellow Innovation Specialist here at Cornell Hillel.
Awesome. Okay, thanks so much. Nate?
Yeah, hi. I am at Michigan State University Hillel. I'm the Jewish Student Life Coordinator here.
Okay, wicked cool, as we say in Massachusetts. Mara?
Hi, I'm Mara from Temple University. I'm the Engagement Associate here.
Nice. My mother's alma mater, as it happens, Temple University. Ben?
Hey, good morning. This is Ben Zeiger from Hillel 818 in the not currently sunny at the moment San Fernando Valley, Los Angeles.
Got it. I love the San Fernando Valley. LA is where I'm going to move. Some people want to get warmth in Florida or Arizona. I'm all LA, and I don't like Northern California. I'm an LA partisan. Kayla?
Hi.
Hi.
It's good to actually be face-to-face. I am at American University doing development and a big Unorthodox fan.
Oh, thank you so much. Now wait, I said Kayla, and I had someone else in my screen who called Kayla Bogad. But do we have two Kaylas?
No, I'm Michaela. I misheard.
Oh. No, well, hi, Michaela. Okay, hi. That's great. Nice to meet you. Kayla.
Hi.
Hi.
People usually call me Michaela, so I'm used to it.
Amazing.
I'm Kayla. I am the Assistant Director for Hillel at the University of Rochester.
And I'm Meg. I'm the Springboard Innovation Fellow here at University of Rochester as well.
Got it. And wonderful. Nice to meet you both. We've gained a couple people. Elisa Moses?
Yeah.
Or
Hi.
Moses hyphen something. No, Moses hyphen Ryerson, which is where you work, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Yeah.
My name is Alyssa. I'm the Associate Director of Ryerson University, which is in Toronto, Canada.
Got it. Nice to meet you. Marley?
Hi, I'm Marley Wiener. I am the Senior Jewish Educator at Hillel at the University of Binghamton.
Great. Nice to meet you. And Lauren?
Yeah, Binghamton. Go Bearcats.
I'm Lauren Fine. I'm the Director of Student Leadership at North Carolina Hillel here at UNC.
Great. So nice to meet you all. So I will just say, let me say a couple things as a prefatory remark. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give some composite ideas. None of these is specific to one school, though each of them is inspired by one school in particular, but I've changed, because we're working from negatives today, I've changed identifying characteristics, names, and kind of shifted things around a bit to look at some mistakes that communities make, that I've seen Hillels make. And this is partly drawn from my work as a journalist, but partly also I do a lot of scholar in residence gigs now. I do a lot of public speaking. And so I've been to a lot of Hillels, more than most Hillels, in fact. Like I've been to more congregations than most rabbis have. And that's one of the nice things about being a journalist and kind of public speaker on these things, is that I get to see a lot. So I want to be clear that I don't know how to do what you guys do. I really, really honor the work that Jewish educators, community professionals, clergy, etc., social worker, people who work in Jewish communal life in doing the one-to-one direct service, do something that I don't think I'd be very good at. You do it on the front lines. And like my children, I was the beneficiary of it, and now my daughters are the beneficiary of it. And so I have enormous gratitude. And I never want to seem smug. I never want to seem like I think that what you're doing is easy or that mistakes are easily avoided. What you do is hard. Mistakes are always going to happen, as in any field, and you don't get enough credit, and you're grossly underpaid. So I want to just be clear that when in giving this program where I talk about some mistakes people have made, I always want to have in the background how much I honor how much good work you guys do. And usually when I go to Hillel's, I'm just blown away by the extraordinary good work and how functional the communities are. Nevertheless, we're going to talk about some composite and slightly identity befogged versions of things that I've seen go wrong. Some of you all of you will think, oh, I know that place. It's probably not that place. It's probably some other place. And the good news is that when we talk about what not to do, we are in a sense talking about what to do, because when we know how to avoid pitfalls, we also know we are inspired to think and moved to think about things that work. So I'm going to give 3 kind of case studies. In between, we're going to stop and talk about, what do you think? Have you seen that mistake being made? Have you seen how it's been successfully avoided? Do you disagree that it's a mistake? Maybe I've identified something as a potential problem, and you say, actually, that can be really, really fruitful. And that'll be good as well. 2 things I want to get to before I start, 2 more preambles. The first thing is I was watching Dan Smokler's video. He's an old college friend of mine. He talked so much about narrative, how every community needs a narrative. Some of you were on that webinar. And I also watched Beth Cousins' video. You guys have had some great programming. And I was thinking, what is the narrative I want to kind of lead with here? And each community is going to have its own. I definitely realized in interrogating myself that the narrative I think every Hillel should have is just basically like Ahavat Yisrael, right? That what the work we're doing is trying to figure out how to spread Jews' love for the community of fellow Jews. Inevitably, to do that well, we have to love other people. We have to love their Gentile friends and partners. We have to love all of humanity. We have to sometimes make tough decisions about what love looks like. But that basically, if we're ever so lost in the weeds of our work that we're forgetting that the job is basically to figure out how to get the Jewish community to feel unified and to love each other, that's when we've lost a sense of things. And I think you'll see in a minute why I foreground that, because some of the mistakes I'm talking about are mistakes that kind of cut Jews off from fellow Jews and obscure that sense of love. The other thing that I want to foreground as a first principle of mine, and again, some of you may disagree with this. I was talking to someone, an undergraduate recently, who had come up through the Jewish day school system, then was at a college with a very strong Hillel, like a kid who was really steeped in he had been probably a Bronfman fellow. He was going to have a Derod. He was like one of those guys who got all that. He knew how to get the money, right? And he said to me, he said, whenever we talk about innovation, he said, everyone, the funders, the Hillel people, the rabbis, everyone's always looking for like the sparkly next thing. He said, I kind of wish that there were just more competence all around. He said, I wish that all of the B- communal professionals were operating at a B or a B+ level. And he said, I wish that like every synagogue that was like kind of lifeless just had a little more, if it all had 10% more ruach, that'd be this extraordinary victory. As opposed to, here's $50,000 to fund the person who's going to weave a Torah verse using branches that are locally sourced, that, like the sort of sparkly, oh my God, how many different things you haven't heard of can we work into Judaism? That resonated very strongly with me. This kid was 22, and I thought, yes, like looking at having come through, an age where I was being invited to Jewish singles events, now being invited to young family events, seeing what they throw at my kids. So often what we really should be striving for is just to be better at teaching and loving and learning and spending time together in a way that doesn't burn us out, rather than looking for the sparkly thing. So I realize that kind of guides a lot of what I'm saying as well, is that I'm looking for, how can we just we know what to do. We got into this work because we love these people, we love this tradition, and we're trying to figure out how to lead authentic, joyful lives with these people and within this tradition, right? So there actually shouldn't be too much wheel reinventing going on. Now that's a radical statement, because if you talk to certain rabbis, if you hear someone like Amichai Lau-Levi, he will say like every 1,000 years the tradition has to do a 180 and look nothing like it was looking right before it. There have to be these radical breaks, right? So Hasidism comes in the 18th century and says, everything we were doing before looked wrong. We need to totally revolutionize. And he feels like we're at one of those break moments where, and I'm probably misrepresenting what he would say, and he's a very fine rabbi, he can speak for himself, but he would say like, the tradition has some things, but we should be, the Judaism that may carry us forward might look nothing like the tradition of 1950 or even 1990 or even 2010. I don't know. I feel like we just need a lot more like support, competence, and sort of stability in doing the things we know how to do right. With that in mind, let me talk and then about the first of the three kind of pitfalls of innovation that I've seen in my travels. And again, then we're going to break and I want to hear what you think. The first is that some Hillels I've seen believe that, that the problem is a leadership problem and a leadership problem exclusively, right? That is, they feel that if they can just find the one magical rabbi or executive director and empower that person, then the other problems kind of melt away, that there's this kind of single key that you can unlock. And so some of them, for example, will move from a system in which they've had an executive director, an operations director, and a senior educator or campus rabbi to one in which all the power is concentrated in one person. Or they will invest in someone with a very, very particular vision of radical decentralization or radical centralization, right? But everything it's sort of the CEO model, which is, if we fire that CEO and hire this CEO, or if we rebrand, for example, the other problems kind of melt away. So I'm thinking of a particular case where the board decided to actually fire someone who had a strong record of reasonable competence and bring in someone who was extremely charismatic. And by the way, also had a strong record of fundraising. And what happened was that rabbi came in and he or she, will say, raised a tremendous amount of money, built some good relationships with donors, replaced everyone on the board pretty much, like got the board to sort of turn over and then be replaced with people that this rabbi, she or he, really liked and were supportive. And here's the thing. They got 5 or 7 good years out of that, right? The problem is what happens when that person leaves. And in this particular case, what happened was some of the things you'd expect, which is that the donors felt, well, our relationship was with that rabbi. We're not going to fund the next rabbi. So that you'd expect. Some of the board members actually got less involved because they were really fans of that particular rabbi. But here's the thing that that was really troubling, which was student participation fell off drastically, more than you would expect from other Hillels when there's, obviously every time there's rabbi turnover or professional communal leader turnover, there are people who attach to that one person and they're going to, drift off. In this case, it was dramatic. It was like in direct relationship to the rabbi's charisma was their turnover, right? And this is a really, really interesting question because you don't want to not have charismatic rabbis or high energy leaders, right? The problem is that if you end up with a culture that's built entirely around the charismatic rabbi, where people can't imagine what is this Hillel without this particular individual, when it becomes a cult of personality functionally, then when that person first of all, if that person ends up being a sociopath or an embezzler or whatever, you tend to lose a lot more than you ever thought possible, right? That the other thing is the board falls asleep and stops managing that person because they feel like this person is the everything. But the real cost is what happens when students begin to identify their Jewish experience with one human being. This is something we see in the congregational world all the time. I mean, one of the most successful congregations, I'm thinking of 2 congregations. One is built on a model where the rabbi is very, very low charisma, but has done a lot to empower the laity, and in fact has really grown the shul, several percent every year. A nearby shul has grown even more, but that rabbi is retiring after 35 years, and they're expecting to lose about 1/3 of their members because people really went for that person. So here I'd like to pause 1 second. This isn't really so much a case of innovation going wrong. It's really a question of when Hillel change goes wrong. And everyone's always looking to make change. Everyone's always saying, how can we do better? And one of the biggest mistakes that I see made is the overinvestment in a particular vision or in a particular charismatic leader. So here I'd like to pause And I would like to, this is kind of the biggest picture one. This is from 1,000 feet. Then we're going to get to a couple other more specific programmatic mistakes that I've seen being made. But again, those programmatic mistakes are often made by a charismatic leader who comes in and says, here are the 5 things we're going to do that none of you ever thought of before, right? Here's the 5 ways we're going to reinvent the wheel. And everyone says, oh, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yes, rabbi, because the investment is this person's going to fix everything. So here I'd really like to pause, and I'd like to ask about your experiences, not necessarily with your own Hillel, though possibly, but you guys have been around. You've seen other communities. How does one balance those questions? How does one balance the desire to have strong, winning, charming leadership who brings people in with the fact that if people attach their experience to that one person and then that one person leaves, they leave? And meanwhile, those people often have a lot of turnover at the assistant level because their assistants and deputies can't flourish, right? So it can hollow out the institution. I guess I'm curious, if you could play God and pick the perfect rabbi or top, most senior Jewish educator or ED, how do you balance that question of charisma versus too much versus not enough? What do you think? Anyone should feel free to jump in here. And I know people have had these experiences because when I go around as a journalist, these are actually the complaints I hear most often, is either the senior leader, rabbi, ED, whatever, is too low charisma, or they are too high charisma. And I hear both in pretty much equal numbers.
I'm happy to go while some people think, Mark.
Great.
I have worked places where I think people underestimated how charismatic a person was, which is not really the answer to your question, but maybe a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So someone who was let go because they weren't doing a good enough fundraising job, or they weren't doing a good enough job messaging, or whatever the thing was, only for the board to discover that there was a significant chunk of people who actually gave to that person rather than to the organization on some level. And so I wonder how that sometimes gets mistaken or misunderstood to make the wrong choice about letting someone go, or instead of investing and making them better, or whatever the other options are.
Totally. And so there's a few things that I'm hearing there, right? One is that we tend to think that charisma has a few metrics, right? Or that strong leadership has a few metrics, like dollars you can count. So it's very easy for a board to say, oh, this person's not doing as well as this or doing better. That can miss the fact that that person might be a terrific relational leader who has built strong relationships. And we can forget that. The other thing you mentioned that I really like is, what about investing in people to make them better? One mistake, and again, this is the CEO mistake in corporate America, they fire people if you don't hit the bottom line within a year or two, they fire you. Here's the reality. The reality is a lot of the best rabbis, I mean, using rabbis here again as a stand-in for EDs, educators, etc. A lot of the best rabbis, whom we think of as kind of the legendary rabbis or the people who influenced us the most, we knew them when they were 55 or 60 after they'd been in the same job for 20 or 25 years. And there used to be more long-term professionals in social work, communal life, Jewish communal life, right? People moved around less. Our expectations for the first few years were lower. So again, one of the mistakes, and this is tied to a kind of bad sense of what innovation is you'll bring in this person and the revolution will happen overnight. What about people who have a 10-year plan or a 15-year plan? Part of what we have to do is educate boards and donors to say, this person is actually heading on a trajectory where in 15 years, we're going to have a fabulous Hillel, a fabulous Jewish community. That might be what it takes. And do we have the patience for that? Do we have the structures? I know Hillel International is terrific at supporting people over the long term. Often local boards aren't, because they're looking at fundraising dollars, or they look at year number 1 or 2 and say, how many people turned out for the big Hanukkah ball? That's not necessarily the way to look at it. Anyone else have thoughts on sort of how do you measure or value charisma, or overvalue or overmeasure it?
I mean, I, as a rabbi in the room, who was trained specifically into a not necessarily low charisma style, but a collaborative horizontal style. Like my rabbinical school trains people to be very horizontal and relational, as opposed to, my rabbinical school does not train people to build cults of personality, and then if they happen to do it anyway, so be it.
Right.
But no, the advice that I was given when I was in training was, don't change anything major the first year that you show up, and talk to everybody. And if you go into any major decision without knowing what the outcome is going to be, whether or not you agree with it, you've done something wrong. And it's been really interesting. This is the end of my first year at this particular job. In that my counterpart, who was our OUJLIC rabbi, is, I think, definitely operated much more off of the force of his personality, and seeing the difference in the attendance at events and things, and then also seeing, like, all of a sudden at the end of the year, without even realizing it, I ended up with this cohort of students who might not be coming to my classes, but come to me to talk about organizational vision and know that I'll listen to them, which was, like, amazing.
Terrific. Any other thoughts on charisma, how to value it, how to overvalue it or undervalue it?
I think, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I think what's coming to mind for me is when someone with a lot of charisma has a certain vision, but then doesn't or isn't able to take the time to make sure that everyone is on board with it, like students and the rest of the staff. And so even though, on the surface, it might seem like a really great, innovative idea, that sometimes if the time hasn't been taken to where everyone who's actually implementing that vision is on board with it, then it can sort of careen off the edge and not quite reach where we want to go.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing from this as well is, if and with each of these, we should say, okay, if we know what not to do, what do we do, right? What's the affirmative? The affirmative is listening, right? And this is really, again, that sounds obvious. That can really be in tension with innovative mandates, right? The board will often bring in someone who has pitched them on, we're going to revolutionize the Hillel by doing X. If that person comes in having already promised a particular program, and by the way, innovation often implies to boards, you're going to see lots of change, right? Like the Hillel you walk into, it won't look like the Hillel this year. The Hillel you walked into this year that seemed a little bit sleepless and sleepy and lifeless. Next year, the walls will be painted new colors. The kosher kitchen will have a revamped menu, and they'll have 5 things that they sort of will have sold. And as someone who's recently served on a search committee, I can say that a lot of cover letters say, here are the 5 things I'm selling you. Like, you get me, I'll do these 5 things in the first year, right? Or in the first 2 years. And here's the problem is, when someone has been hired with a particular mandate like that, why would they go around and listen to everyone? I mean, they could do it, but there's a dishonesty to it, right? They can go around and say, tell me what you need. But if at the end of the day, they're going to do what they promised the board they would do anyway, and it was specific programmatic, quote, innovations, then actually the listening is really deceitful and lying, and it can set them up for enormous failure. Because all the kids know, hey, we told this new person, don't do X, and she did X. Or we told the new person, do Y, and he didn't do Y. So the flip side of committing to innovation is it can often commit to specific programs that actually don't pass the test of a listening tour. So that's the first big one. I'm going to move on from that. But the first thing is, innovation can go wrong when it allows boards, or kind of precipitates boards, vesting a certain person or a certain new team with a certain fairly inflexible vision that they are supposed to deliver through their charisma, rather than through building consensus, listening to people, all of that stuff. Again, it sounds pretty obvious, but the not obvious part of it is that we have to remember that the second we use a term like go innovate or do something new or transformative, we're actually kind of pre-committing to a forceful CEO, charisma-driven model in some cases, because that's who's going to, in a year or two, innovate or change things. So rather than committing to good leadership, or someone who listens well, or someone who has good emotional intelligence, or someone who will hire well, we commit to a particular innovation. We're committing to the plot rather than the characters. And that's very un-Jewish, actually. Okay, so the second way that innovation can go wrong, this is a very specific one, false dichotomies. Okay, when we commit to a certain idea of who the in-group is or the kind of student whom we want to reach, we're always pre-committing to exclude other people. This happens in various different ways, right? I'll tell a story. All of you have seen versions of this story. I knew a Hillel. I was doing some reporting on a Hillel. I didn't end up writing the article, but basically what they had done was they had looked around and they had seen that certain outreach groups, not Chabad incidentally, but certain other outreach groups were doing certain things very, very well. And they decided they wanted to replicate what those groups were doing. By the way, I'm not talking about Base Hillel or some of the other things you might have heard of. This was a pretty off-the-grid university that had its own situation. But they looked around, they saw that certain Kiruv or outreach organizations were doing a certain thing very well, and they decided to replicate some of it with, you know, more home-based stuff and a rabbinic couple, and they imitated certain kinds of programming. Here was the result of that, right? The result was that they ended up, that actually there had been a kind of, so this was seen as an innovation. Let me back up here. This was seen as a really good innovation, was we're going to take some of the best of what these other groups are doing in a more, you know, Orthodox or Haredi fashion. We're going to repurpose it for a less observant student body, and we're going to, you know, have the best of all possible worlds. That's what they were thinking. And to a certain extent, they did. Here's the thing. They actually hadn't realized that there was a kind of highly functioning organic synergy between some of these other groups, some of these outreach groups, and what they were doing inside the Hillel building. Right down to the fact that sometimes these other groups would use the kosher kitchen because it was one of the very few places you could get kosher dining. They would have their coffee dates there. They might kind of offer a class there. They wouldn't officially sign up to do it, but they'd say, hey, meet me in that lounge or in the Beit Midrash, we'll study. But actually there had been a non-articulated but highly functioning synergy between Hillel and some other groups. And the second Hillel decided to innovate based on what these other groups were doing, it essentially committed to excluding these groups, because pretty much the pretty obvious implication is we want to do it with a vibe and with a religious spirit that is not the way you do it. All of a sudden, the other groups, quite rightly, kind of felt like they were being pushed out and marginalized. They felt it was a hostile attack. We can talk about whether there would have been ways to mitigate that, right? But whatever the case, they weren't mitigating it. They weren't mitigated. And all of a sudden, what had been a non-competitive relationship turned into a competitive relationship where either you were at Hillel or you were at this other group for classes or for a high holiday or for a Shabbat dinner or for pastoral counseling. You either kind of had to pick the Hillel rabbi or the other rabbi. So this seemed to me, now you can argue about whether or not the Hillel team did the right thing, but at the end of the day, the result was very, very clear, which was there was a spirit of animosity, so that now they were modeling for students who were maybe, again, 18, 19, 20 years old, fairly new to Jewish communal life. They'd grown up in this community or that community, maybe among Jews, maybe not, but they didn't sense that Jews were always at each other's throats, right? And now what Hillel has done for them is essentially model a situation where Jews are at each other's throats. They've essentially, these kids' first introduction to Jewish communal life is that you have to pick teams, rather than on a campus, everyone's kind of in it together. Like Hillels can be places of radical inclusion and radical pluralism, as you guys know. So a lot of you have seen this dynamic on various campuses. Often it plays out with Chabad, non-Chabad, but not only, right? Because Aish might be on your campus, Chabad might be there. There's various other groups and clubs and outreach movements that the names of which I'm not even remembering right now. There's many species of this. And I know that a lot of campuses say, what do we do with them, right? And so frequently they see it as a spurred innovation. We will take from what they're doing, but try to do it better, or try to do it in the spirit of Hillel or in the spirit of our campus, of how we know our students. And again, then they can end up with some sort of bad blood or competitive spirit. Let's move away for 1 second from that particular model, right? Where it's kind of observant versus non-observant, or Kiruv outreach-based versus Hillel kind of building-based, whatever you want to do. Those are all oversimplifications. Let's look at other ways that Judaism draws these lines, right? Hillels are often in a position of having to say, like, who counts as halakhically Jewish, right? Maybe there's a minyan there. Maybe there's an Orthodox minyan, a partnership minyan, whatever, a mechitza minyan, whatever it is, where they have to figure out who here is able to participate. And sometimes the students who are coming don't have the halachic knowledge to even know. How do you handle that? The big one, of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it, is campuses where, and we've seen this happen, right, where left-leaning student groups, students who are very left on Israel, students who are parts of groups that may support BDS or may be accused of supporting BDS, want to use the building or want to use the Hillel name, Hillel sponsorship, right? And, you know, Hillel has come down in a particular position on this. I haven't read the latest audit, but I know that Hillel International has to decide. But then, of course, every campus to some extent has some liberty to decide for itself where they come down. To me, the question is always, or one question that you can't avoid is, how do we make sure that we don't split the Jewish community into these Jews versus those Jews, right? So the Kiruv-based Chabad Aish versus Hillel, traditional Hillel International community-based, that's just one version of how Hillels can inadvertently split their communities, right? We certainly have campuses now where a quarter or a third of all self-identified Jews basically feel alienated from the Hillel because they feel their politics are to the left of the Hillels, right? Now, where does this come back to innovation going right or wrong? Very often what's happening is that, one innovation is you have to come up with a policy. It's basically, in this day and age, Hillels are saying, how do we have an Israel policy? How do we have a pro-Israel or, Israel enthusiastic or Israel engaged community? And so you have to come up with programming, you have to come up with official policies, you have to come up with ideas about how to use the building, how to spend money. Always be asking the question, can we do this in a way that doesn't create these Jews versus those Jews, that doesn't create a Chabad versus non-Chabad, a BDS versus non-BDS model? Inevitably, people will feel these things, but is there a way to do it such that the foregrounding principle is Achavas Yisrael, right? Obviously, with the political stuff, that's really the hardest, right? But there are models that come from other kinds of questions, right? How do you make a big tent? Again, I've seen Hillels where the Chabad or Aish or other outreach groups are doing their meetings in the Hillel, right? That diminishes the tension. What about the question of secular Jews or Hillel Jews versus the Jews who would never set foot in Hillel? How do you break that down? One of the ways I've seen that broken down is, can you get your campus registrar to schedule academic classes inside the Hillel building? Can some Judaic studies classes meet at the Hillel Beit Midrash or classroom, right? Obviously one of the low-hanging ones is, can the yoga class meet there? How about not have, the simple version is have the Jewish yoga class meet there, or the Havdalah yoga, right? The more sophisticated version in terms of not having those Jews versus those Jews is ask the campus, the gym, whoever offers yoga to the whole campus, do you want to use our space? The more you can bring people into the Hillel space, the more you are encouraging people to think of it as an organic community that's part of the weave of the whole campus, rather than there are these kids who set foot in the building and there are these kids who don't. In some ways, I felt that one of the most spiritually meaningful things that I've seen is when I was at the UCLA Hillel, and they have kind of famously a coffee shop right there run by Coffee Bean, the great, Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf, the great California coffee chain. They basically got them to move a kosher franchise, into the lobby of the Hillel. Now, it's a little bit of a gimmick in a sense, but what that's saying is, even to students who identify as anti-Hillel, whether for political reasons, whether for observance reasons, maybe they identify with Chabad or with another stream or whatever, hey, if they want a cup of coffee and they're walking down this street, they can go into that place. So to me, again, the big picture question, how do you keep false dichotomies from emerging? And I guess I'd like to pause here and ask you guys, what are the dichotomies on your campus? And by the way, they're not always false. They're actually real. They represent genuine disagreements, whether it's political, pro-Israel versus anti-Israel, whether it's Haredi versus non-Haredi, whether it's Hillel identified versus non-Hillel identified. But how do you craft policies and innovations that remind people that while those dichotomies are real, they aren't real in an eternal spiritual sense, right? In the theological sense that we should all be honoring, we are all Jews and we all want to be together in solidarity and love of Israel, right? Yisrael, right? With the people Israel. So how do you, I guess I'm curious, A, what are the false dichotomies or the semi-false dichotomies that exist on your campuses? And B, what are some effective ways you've seen to break them down? I'll put that question out there.
I think I'll go ahead and share something that our campus has been dealing with this past year, because we are a team of 4 on a relatively large campus. Our Jews are 15 to 20% of the student population, and something when it comes to our prayer services on Shabbat and stuff, we're continuously thinking about how we can serve our students who are looking for a more traditional halachic space to pray, but also for a larger percentage of students on campus who don't fall into that category, how we're creating a compelling, innovative Shabbat experience for them. And because we have such limited human and financial resources, how are we engaging a larger group of students that maybe haven't experienced Shabbat before, but also honoring the fact that we do have a group of students that are looking for a traditional Shabbat service.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a dichotomy that I hadn't articulated, but that's like a huge dichotomy, right? I mean, I was actually amazed. I've also seen, by the way, regional dichotomies. I mean, I've seen that, I've seen this a lot on West Coast campuses, and, at least one of you there is from the 818, but students who, New York and Boston, if a student says, I grew up in the conservative movement, and I'm going to get pilloried for this here, but I'll just say it, right? I'll just be indiscreet. Kids who grow up in New York or Boston and say, I'm from the conservative movement, I've done conservative camping, their knowledge of tefillah, I have found, is stronger than the kids who say the same from LA. That just, it's a more observance, it's more tefillah-driven sensibility. I don't have the evidence to back that up, but I've heard it from rabbis as well, which is that, like, yeah, if you have a dozen kids at Brandeis or Northeastern or Yale or whatever who show up for the conservative minyan, like, they can run it themselves. And that's not necessarily true in some other parts of the country, where just Judaism is a little bit more keyed to other things than synagogue observance. So, but those dichotomies are very real, right? A kid shows up and they don't know the prayer book versus the kid who does. They're immediately feel into two different communities, right? Any other thoughts on, like, the dichotomies that you find on your campus, and how do you, and the worries you have about bridging them? What are the dichotomies you see on your campuses, the ins and the outs?
What you said about regional dichotomies is very true here in North Carolina. I think we probably have some specific challenges that other campuses don't have. And I think one of them that the staff often gets stuck in and is talking about a lot is there are students who, grew up in Jewish life and immediately feel comfortable here. And then students who just are so uncomfortable and don't even want us to say the word Jewish to them, and like don't want to talk to us because they're like uncomfortable with their own identity and whatever. And we sort of get stuck in this idea that they're either one or the other. And really, actually, when you talk to people, like, they want to engage in their Jewishness, but like kind of don't know what the first step is. And, I don't know, there's various ways that we've tried to address it, but it's always something that we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, where I've seen that successfully done, sometimes it's really like going right into the belly of the beast, and discussion groups about, like, what does being Jewish mean to you? What is your Jewish identity? Is something that, I've seen one of those where a kid who was coming out of, like, Lakewood yeshivas and then decided to go secular and was enrolled in a secular university was one of the strong participants. And then there was somebody who grew up a quarter Jewish, didn't really know what it meant, but both of them were sort of wrestling, but coming from different directions. And so discussion groups around that, Friday night dinners where you have a Dvar Torah of 2 minutes that touches on that. Like, everyone has identity questions is one of the things I found. Like, certainly as, the great insight I've had hosting my podcast and hearing from, hundreds of people who write us letters is, like, the only people more unsure what it means to be Jewish than, the sort of barely affiliated lefties are, like, the people in Borough Park who secretly write to us and, like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And they have the same questions as well. And so those questions around identity are one way that you can kind of bring people together. I want to move on, but did anyone have anything that they wanted to say about dichotomies? I don't want to cut anyone off if you had one that's, like, we haven't gotten to, that's really pronounced on your campus. Okay, then I'll move on to the third thing. And again, I'm getting more and more specific here about, like, innovation when innovation goes wrong. Just to back up, we started with the question of, like, innovation that overly relies on charisma or on a specific pre-articulated vision. The second one is innovation that creates false dichotomies, right? That adopts a model that excludes some people or gets buy-in from these, but then definitely won't get buy-in from those. And the third, narrowing it even more, and this one is really specific, and I really want to hear what you think about this, is the question of innovation that relies on very short-term initiatives or one-offs. right? Like things, we're going to do this amazing event, and it's going to draw a lot of people, but it's just this one event, this one time. And we'll hope that we'll collect a lot of emails or generate a lot of meetings out of that or expand our database. We don't know. Hopefully we will, but it's a one-off event. Now, all of us in our programming, and this includes in journalism, right? We do this all the time. We say, oh, we're going to do a special series on such and such this year for Purim or for the election season or whatever. And it's meant to be a one-off, and it allows us to, it energizes us. We think, here's this thing that won't be this recurring thing 48 or 50 or 52 weeks a year. There's going to be a big run up to it, and then we're going to do it, and it's going to be like the best, So a great example of this from the Jewish communal world, and by the way, it's an example I totally revere. I'm not in any way putting it down. I'm just using it as an illustrative example. Do any of you remember the big event in New York City in Union Square, Sukkah? Was it Sukkah City, where they built, like they basically gave over this park? If you don't know about it, you have to Google it. It's maybe 7-8 years ago now. And basically they took Union Square, this big urban space in New York City, and got all these artists and builders and architects to build halakhically valid sukkahs, right? So, there's certain rules, right? It has to have a certain amount of covering, but not too much. And it has to be, permeable to rain. And then X number of walls have to be covered. But, within those rules, you can do really cool stuff. You can build one that looks like, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You can build one that looks like the pyramids in Egypt. You can build one that looks like an igloo. And basically they gave over this park to all of these interesting, hip architects, artists, builders who had their own versions of what one was going to look like. Some of you must remember that, right? And yeah, okay, Marley does. I got a thumbs up from her. Anyway, it was covered everywhere. It was covered by the secular press as well, not just the Forward and Tablet, but the New York Times, and it was on National Public Radio. Amazing example of Jewish innovation, spirit, some philanthropic dollars at work, right? Kind of thing, by the way, that any of you could do on your campuses, right? You could go into the architecture school. Let's say you got a donor with $1,000. You could go to the architecture major or the architecture school and say, we're going to give 500, 250, 250, the three best structures that you build. You give them the rules for the structures, and all of a sudden you have an event that's pulled in the architecture major, that's pulled in a bunch of students, that's pulled in community members. You'll get on the nightly news, right? It's a brilliant idea. But it was a one-off, right? It was not replicated, and nor was it designed to be clear. Now, it was funded by a number of Jewish initiatives, including Reboot, which some of you know, right? There was philanthropic dollars that went into it. If you asked, what did this do for Jewish life and continuity going forward? And by the way, that wasn't their metric, right? They were trying to do a cool thing one time, and there's enormous value in doing a cool thing one time, right? But let's say you were doing it on campus and you really wanted to appraise afterwards, how much Jewish engagement did that event create, right? It was innovative. It came to us from this very cool visiting scholar, artist in residence, with all of this great yichus from who had studied with this prize-winning architect, but also did this cool work on sexuality and this cool work on reclaiming Yiddish, and everyone loved it, right? And then if you say, okay, a month later, how is the community better? Or how is the community more engaged? By the way, you could always ask the same thing of an innovative musical event or concert, or the Jewish origami class that you offer in the Hillel for one semester, right? That meets 8 times. Anything that's cool is probably, there's almost an inverse relationship between coolness and replicability, right? Actually, because if something becomes routine, if you do it all the time, it actually ceases to seem cool. It begins to seem routine, right? So the question when you do something that strikes people as innovative because it's new, it's probably a one-off, at least initially. Is that a positive thing for your Hillel, right? I'm thinking in this case of a Hillel that had some money. They had a budget to hire a new person, let's say half-time, not a major rabbinic or executive director position, but kind of like, this was a large Hillel. This was going to be like their 5th hire, right, on staff, on the sort of education rabbinic side of things, right? And they decided to hire an arts coordinator. And this was someone with a music background who ended up bringing in a bunch of visiting musicians who were doing cool concerts, also curated an art gallery, stuff like that. And what they found actually was that although the events drew more people into the building over the coming year than had ever been in the building in the previous, let's say, 5 years. I won't say forever, but I'll say the previous 5 years, right? They found that it was a different group of people each time, right? So now they had sort of like 6 communities or 6 mailing lists. They had the people who were regularly in the building for kosher meals or davening or whatever. Then they had the people who, it turns out, would show up when you did a jazz concert, a Jewish jazz fusion concert. Then you had the people who would show up when you had an origami artist. Then you had another 20 or 30 people who showed up when there were traditional paintings in a gallery on the wall. Then you had a number of people who would show up when it was like artistic Jewish bungee jumping, whatever, right? So you now had 6 different groups. Had your numbers increased? Unquestionably. Like unquestionably, each of these events brought in a lot of people. But actually, none of these groups of people knew each other, and none of them carried over to other aspects. So it actually turned out that the people who were interested in visual arts and painting were not that interested in origami. It's not like people who love arts love all arts, right? I happen to love music and literature, no particular interest in going to see modern dance. That's just me, right? Some of you will feel differently. Everyone has some arts that they love, right? But they created a bunch of different micro communities that comprised a lot of people who'd never been in the building before, or had never attended a Jewish communal event on this campus before. So in a sense, you can't deny that this was a win, that this person if they had just hired another assistant rabbi to offer Torah classes, or to create another brand of davening, right, another minyan, they would have pulled in a few more people, but basically they would have been drawing from the same pool of people whose names they already knew. This art curator, director, engagement person drew in lots of people who never would have engaged the community before, but none of them had any carry over to other parts of the community. So I put that out there as a very specific, very concrete example of an innovation that looked at through one lens looks like an extraordinary win, and looked at through another lens looks like innovation gone wrong. And I'm really curious to hear, how would you perceive that? If you had someone who could come on, do a series of one-off events that got engagement from lots of people, but that person, her or himself, didn't have an idea of how to convert them into more regularly engaged people or people who talk to each other. Is that a good use of Hillel staff dollars? Are we excited that that person's been there? And here's the question that this Hillel actually had to answer is, when the grant for another, again, half-time job with benefits got renewed, do you use it on that person again, or is there a better use of staff dollars? What do you think?
So I want to jump in with a similar sort of example that sort of relates. When I first started at Hillel, we also had a grant to do programming. We're very based on commuter schools. So we had a grant to do programming that were specifically for commuters that live in a certain area of the city, Toronto, so north of Toronto. And similar, we also sort of did arts things, we did sports things, we did different criteria that met the grant requirements. However, like you sort of said in this example, when the grant ended, so did the money towards all those things. And what was lacking is exactly like you said, the follow-up. But at the same time, there wasn't necessarily the funding to go towards the follow-up of the sports and the arts and leadership and all the different things. So I think that is a good question to answer. I think you need to have follow-up. I think what a good thing would be is for the staff person to then go after all the people that came to the different things and say, okay, we don't necessarily have that same amount of funding, but how can we still continue this programming going forward? And maybe in the arts example, maybe it could be an evening of many arts. Sort of, you have the art gallery, and then you have a singer, and you have the jazz on the way in. Try and collaborate all those different ideas into a couple more programs or events to bring those people back in the door more than once.
Really interesting. Okay, thanks for that. Who else? What do you do with that scenario where someone has come in, done a lot of one-offs that have had success, but hasn't managed to turn them into a web of engagement?
I mean, a lot of it's about ongoing one-on-one relationship building. You know, like, sure, they come to your fancy artisanal skydiving. Okay, great. I guarantee fancy artisanal skydiving is not the only thing that they're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And so either you yourself or, Hillel leadership or your campus engagement interns or whoever, depending on the student, finds that person and has a chance to chat with them a little bit about, the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of take it from there.
So that's definitely one thing, right? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, and maybe maybe the artisanal skydiving group becomes sort of an ongoing thing within the Hillel. That I'm sorry, I'm just really tickled by the phrase artisanal skydiving. Maybe that becomes an ongoing like sub community within the Hillel, and that's great too. Like I think about our Holla for Hunger chapter, which has a whole bunch of students who show up weekly for baking and selling, and it's this massive network. And those students don't necessarily come to other things, but they're really engaged with their challah. And it's
right.
great.
I mean, to use the Christian term, like it's one of your congregation's ministries, right? I mean, Jews don't have as much of a worked out language for this because we don't study or congregational development as much as the evangelicals do. But you have a bunch of ministries. Not everyone is a Sunday morning worshiper. Some people are involved in sisterhood or brotherhood or men's group. Some people are involved in Challah for Hunger. So like you give people different ways to plug in. The thing I want to point out about a certain kind of innovation is it gives too many ways to plug in, right? The arts coordinator I'm talking about came in and did 8 or 10 different things, none of which had appropriate follow-up. If this person had done 4 things and then devoted the other half of the job to following up with the people showing up at those 4 would have had more payoff, right? But here's the thing, that's not as flashy to a board, right? So to a board or to a really short-sighted ED, the annual report at the end of the year of what happened in our Hillel this year looks better if you say we had origami and skydiving and visual arts and modern dance and this and that and Challah. Like the 10 things looks better. In fact, the 10 things might have yielded much thinner engagement, much worse engagement, and fewer people. And here's a big question, right? Fewer people who then sophomore year, junior year after the summer break come back, right? Because there wasn't the follow-up, the relationships weren't built. I want to get one more person in there, and then I have a final question I'm going to leave you with. But is there one more person who wants to talk about that question of like the one-off? How meaningful is it? I mean, maybe one of you has had a situation where a big event has actually, even though it's not replicable, even though it can't be a weekly event, has actually been transformative. Maybe, Dan Smokler talked about how when you start a community, you do need some event at some point to have a kind of big from on high view and say, hey, look at this, there are 400 people here. Did we ever think we'd get here? And maybe every community needs that one-off event once a year. Although I'd argue, like, do it right and make it replicable. Like, make it the Purim party every year, or the, I was going to say the Tisha B'Av something, but it wouldn't be because that's summer vacation and it's a sad event anyway. But, is there somebody who wants to defend the idea of like the big one-off event and spending money on it, even at the expense of someone of those dollars going towards regular engagement?
Sure, I will.
Okay.
So our Hillel has been on this campus in various forms for the last 70-something years.
Where are you again?
I'm at the University of Rochester.
Got it. Okay.
We used to serve like the entire area, so like 30-mile radius, but now we just serve the University of Rochester.
Mm-hmm.
And for like the last, 20 years or so, Hillel's been doing this thing called Shabbat Hagadol, which usually coincided with like the Interfaith Chapel's whole interfaith week and whatever, and they would invite all of these different faiths together and have a Shabbat experience, and kind of be like a meet your neighbors kind of thing, and we have these similar values and whatever. And then when we stopped serving all of the local universities and only this one, that disappeared because obviously staff changes. But students and faculty and staff were complaining that we weren't doing it anymore. And so when I got here, I was like, great, so let's do it. So we actually now do it in February in conjunction with Avi Schaefer Shabbat. Last year we saw 50 people. This year we saw 75, plus we had an a cappella group perform. And it's kind of gone from a sit-down dinner to more of a cocktail hour kind of thing where people can walk around and there's like, they get different colored name tags, so they have to talk to different people, and then there's questions on the table. And it's been a very interesting experience, like watching this morph from a sit-down dinner and like this is how you do Shabbat to having explanations of the ritual items out and having students just naturally go and look at them and touch them and do them, and also talking to each other, and then having interfaith a cappella groups sing about what it is we're trying to accomplish. And it's a big draw. And you know what? Sometimes we see students for the first time and then we don't see them again until next year when we do it. But that's the thing that they like and that they come to.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not
I think that sounds amazing. And I would only point out, like, I think it's the best of both worlds because it feels like a one-off, but it's annual, right? But like you actually, and that means you know how to iterate and you know how to do it right. So again, like the thing that I'm trying to inject a note of caution in is fetishizing one-offs for their own sake, right? Where we're going to have someone come in and do 8 or 10 different things. If you have that person come in and do a bunch of different things, be taking notes about which ones work. And then if you hire that person back for another year, I'll say her, it could be a him, tell her, do those 4 or do those 3. Those were great. And in fact, we want to reduce your scope this year. We don't want you doing 10, even though you have a bundle of energy and you've gotten, your systems down and you could do 10 more easily this year. Actually do 3, because those are the ones that seem to have the most promise. The goal should always be to find, look, Jews work on a calendar. We believe in ritual. We ultimately feel, and again, I would say this is true whether you're observant of Jewish law or you just have your own observances of, family night, family dinner. Like, we are a community of people who definitely believe in the wisdom that also, sociologists have discovered is true, which is that people are happier and lead more fulfilled lives when they mark things with milestones and rituals and a certain regularity, right? So I do believe I will make a normative, I will take a stance here, I'll make a claim that one-offs can be destructive if they're not seen as a way to figure out what you want to be non-one-offs. Like, they should be ways to figure out what do we want to add to our ritual life. It could be annual, it could be quadrennial, like graduation, right? Like, nobody wants to graduate every year, but the idea that it's coming around, that that it's on the docket, and that you can think about how to do it right and what it looks like is really, really fruitful. So that is my kind of, just to wrap up, and then I want to pose a final question to you, kind of 3 things to be worried about. One is, just to recap, innovations that rely on a particular force of personality or charisma who is then tasked with doing them irrespective of what the stakeholders actually want, right? The second is any innovation that creates false dichotomies, that marginalizes people who are already doing certain good work, and that tends to create a sense of, like, the Jews who attach to that innovation and the Jews who don't, right? That loses sight of the oneness of our people. And then the third is always be wary of the short-term initiative, the short-term burst of energy that doesn't have systems in place to figure out how to go long-term or how to replicate it. The last thing I want to do, I see that we have 90 seconds left, but maybe we'll take 2.5 minutes rather than 1.5, is I want to ask you guys, and maybe you've covered this in other webinars, other meetings of this, but certainly I will learn from it, and some of you will who haven't heard it before. Could each of you say something about, like, or those who want, say something about what's the best innovation you've seen? Like, what's the thing you didn't know about when you entered your job that you've seen come to fruition, whether from your own thinking or someone else who's come through, another staff person, that you want other Hillels to know about? What's the thing you guys are doing? It could be very prosaic. It could just be like, somebody always stands at the front door and offers hugs. I don't know. But what's the thing that you guys are doing that you want to share with the others? Like, brag a little.
This year, right before right before Passover, the week before Passover, we had a bunch of student leaders make a bunch of different kinds of charoset and go to the pit, which is the center of campus at UNC, and just yell, like, free Passover food, which most of the people don't even know what that means. So we just did that for probably 4 hours. And wow, people love charoset. The love of charoset is so real and so strong that, like, the students who loved it came, like, running over, and the students who had no idea what we were talking about came over too. And it turned out to be a great way to engage people who we've never met and people who we see all the time and non-Jewish students. It was great. It was just like
Amazing.
a random idea that someone came up with.
I don't love charoset, but now I wanted to, maybe one of these would sell me on it. What else? That's a great idea. What else?
At our school at Ryerson, it's sort of like college style. It used to be a college, now it's a university. So the school very much encourages students in their programs to get involved in extracurricular for credit. So we actually did a really cool event. We called it Wine and Design. We brought in Brian Gluckstein, who is a well-known designer here in Toronto. And basically we got the school to give time credits to the students that helped work with us, Hillel, on our event. So we had a bunch of students in fashion, design, arts, get their requirement to their hours by helping Hillel with our program that they then use towards their credit. So it's cool. We got a lot of non-Jewish students involved and also Jewish students in the arts that we didn't know about. And it was a really innovative way of getting Hillel sort of in a better place on campus within the Ryerson community.
Amazing. Any others? I promise I won't go past 1:05. I have 3.5 minutes left. I'm going to keep you 5 minutes late. Any others?
One thing that we've been trying to emphasize more at Hillel is bringing Shabbat to our students. So we've been partnering with different schools on campus, the Industrial Labor Relations School, to do a Shabbat dinner in their building with their professors giving a Devar Torah. And for those specific students, we do a hoteli Shabbat in the hotel on campus and different things like that. And it just brings in different students that don't usually come to our kosher dining hall for dinners, which is usually our observant students that go to that.
Amazing. I love the idea of hoteli Shabbat. I hope it's as awesome as it sounds. Any others?
We also do something about Shabbat. A lot of our students don't really know what to do or how to create a Shabbat experience on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So we created Shabbox. It's Shabbat in a box. It's free for students. It's a monthly subscription, and they get it at their university mailbox once they subscribe. Essentially, we give them door-safe candles, which is LED tea lights, a local kosher challah, Wegmans grape juice because it's the best, and something else to make their Shabbat experience more meaningful. So usually at the beginning of the year, they get some kind of DIY mezuzah kit. They've had shalom coloring. They made their own challah plates. They had sand art for the walls in their dorms. Things that we're looking at for next year: make your own garagers, make your own tzedakah box. It basically just helps them build their own Jewish homes and helps them realize that you don't have to physically be with me to be Jewish and to have a meaningful Jewish experience.
That's a great idea. Yeah. Is there one last one, or shall I a final thought? So first of all, this has been amazing, and I've learned a tremendous amount. I want to thank you for spending this time with me. I think that looking affirmatively, right? One of the things that I see that breaks down all of these, like, again, if we look at the three possible ways that innovation goes wrong, again, the over-reliance on a single Hillel employee and vision, the false dichotomies, and then the short-term initiatives. One of the things that I've seen that pushes back against all of those, and several of you have just kind of intuited that in the things you brought about, is the involvement of other professionals, right? We all have this idea, quite rightly, like, how do we get out to all the kids, right? How many Jews are there on campus? How many Jewishly curious? How many people who are part Jewish or might be Jewish or want to spend time with us? How many Gentile allies, right? But I know at Yale, where I teach part-time, seldom do they ask anything of professors. I have started holding some office hours in the Hillel, right? And I mean, it's not where my formal office hours are, but I will say to students, you want to meet with me this week? Like, I'm going to be eating lunch at the Kosher Kitchen on Tuesday. That brings in students, including Jewish students, who would never otherwise. And I don't see it as like, I'm not trying to make Jewish students more Jewish. I'm really just inviting people, including Gentile students, into a space that a lot of them would never otherwise go to. At Yale, anyway, where we have a very big building, my singular goal is like to get the registrar to schedule classes into this building. Like, let's make it another classroom building and just have people coming in and out all day, right? So I really feel like hearing the hotel school being used, right? Hearing people thinking about how are we going to involve the dorms by putting up mezuzot and having Shabbat there. Thinking of the resources of the whole campus, not just in terms of students who are hard to wrangle, but how do you get like deans, professors, other people who are a little less hard to wrangle, who might sign on to things pretty easily and be proud that they've done it? That to me is a big challenge. With 10 seconds to go, I will just thank you for your time and keep up the good work. I personally am really grateful. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Mark, so much for an awesome conclusion to our series. We hope everyone has a wonderful summer. Please take a quick moment to fill out the brief evaluation that was posted on the group chat. I know both the SIC and the CATS Innovation folks really care about what you have to say, and we'd love to get your feedback, and we look forward to seeing you at Higa in the wintertime. Thanks, guys.
And thank you to Yael for all your work on this. And thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.